She used me as a free babysitter every weekend, until I left her with a surprise she couldn't escape. I am 73 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I sat at the head of my own dining room table and watched my son's face go white as a bedsheet while a lawyer I hired read out loud exactly what I had done to protect myself from the family that had been quietly planning to throw me away. If you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Stay with me, because the ending is not what anyone at that table expected, including me. Before I go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes grandparents are people, not free labor, hit that like button right now and go ahead and subscribe, because I have a feeling you're going to want to see what else I share after this one. And while you're at it, type in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one, and honestly, some evenings your comments are the only company I have. So tell me your city, tell me your country, I want to know who's sitting with me for the next few minutes. My name is Clara. I raised 2 children mostly on my own after my husband died young. And I did it working double shifts at a diner for 11 years before I finally landed a steady job at an insurance office where I stayed until I retired. I tell you this not to complain, but so you understand something about me. I know what hard work looks like. I know what sacrifice looks like. And I know the difference between a family member asking for help and a family member deciding you no longer have a say in your own life because it's convenient for them to treat you that way. Started small, the way these things always do. My son Brian and his wife Melissa have 2 children, Sophie, who was 7 when this all began, and Tyler, who was 4. Every Friday afternoon, without fail, my phone would ring around 3 o'clock. Not a question. Never a question. Just an announcement. Mom, we're dropping the kids at 6, we've got a thing this weekend. A thing. That was the word every single time. Sometimes the thing was a wedding. Sometimes it was a work conference. Sometimes, I found out much later, the thing was simply that they wanted a weekend to themselves and I was the easiest, cheapest, most reliable solution available. I want to be honest with you. I didn't mind at first. I loved having those babies in my house. I loved making pancakes shaped like bunny rabbits and reading the same picture book 4 times in a row until Tyler finally drifted off. There is nothing in this world quite like a grandchild falling asleep on your shoulder. For the first year, I would have called it a gift, not a burden. But a gift that's demanded of you stops being a gift. It becomes a job. And I was working that job every single weekend, 52 weeks a year, without a single day of pay, without so much as a thank you card, without even gas money for the drives to school pickup when Melissa's schedule got complicated, which happened more and more often. I want you to understand the scope of this. Friday evening to Sunday night every week for going on 4 years. That is over 200 weekends. That is more nights caring for those 2 children than some full-time parents put in. And when I finally gently brought it up, when I asked if maybe every other weekend might work better for my back, for my knees, for the arthritis that was creeping into my hands, Melissa looked at me like I had suggested we sell the children. She said, and I remember this word for word because it cut me so deep, she said, Clara, this is just what grandmothers do. My mother would kill to have this kind of relationship with her grandkids. As if I should be grateful. As if my exhaustion was a character flaw. Brian, my own son, said nothing. He just stood behind her in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, looking at the floor. That silence told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in that house. So I kept doing it. I kept showing up every Friday with my overnight bag and my patience wearing thinner each week, because I loved those children more than I loved my own comfort. And because some old foolish part of me still believed that if I just proved myself devoted enough, eventually they would see me, really see me, and things would change. Here is where the story turns, and I need you to lean in close for this part, because this is the piece nobody expected, including me. About 8 months ago, I went to pick up a prescription refill and ran into an old coworker of mine. A sharp woman named Iris who I hadn't seen in years. We got to talking over coffee the way old friends do, and somewhere between the small talk and the second cup, she mentioned, almost in passing, that her son had recently moved his own mother into a memory care facility, and that the family had done it for financial reasons while the house sat empty, ready to be sold once probate cleared. Iris said it so casually. I remember feeling a chill run straight through me, because something about the phrase for financial reasons stuck like a splinter in my mind and wouldn't come loose. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about a comment Melissa had made a few weeks earlier, one I'd brushed off at the time. We had been talking about my house, the little 3-bedroom I'd lived in for 31 years, the one I raised Brian in, the one with the oak tree out back that Sophie loved climbing. Melissa had said, almost dreamily, This place would be perfect for us once you're settled somewhere smaller. Settled somewhere smaller. I hadn't thought twice about it in the moment. Grandmothers hear that kind of thing all the time. People projecting a future that hasn't happened yet. But now, sitting awake at 2 in the morning with Iris's story rattling around in my skull, I started paying closer attention. And once you start paying attention, you cannot stop seeing. I noticed Brian had started asking odd questions. Little things. Whether I'd updated my will recently. Whether I still had the deed to the house or if it was somewhere he could help me organize. He mentioned more than once, a nice assisted living community across town. Always framed as concern. Always wrapped in the language of love. We just want you taken care of, Mom. I noticed Melissa had started referring to my house, in front of the children no less, as Grandma's old place, like I had already left it. I am not a paranoid woman. I raised 2 children and buried a husband, and I have seen enough of life to know the difference between genuine worry and a slow, patient hunger dressed up as concern. What I was watching unfold in my own family was the second thing. So I did something I had never done in 73 years of putting everyone else first. I made a decision entirely for myself, and I made it quietly. I called a lawyer, a woman named Susan who a friend from my church recommended, someone with no connection whatsoever to my family. I told her everything. The babysitting with no pay, no thanks, no boundaries respected. The comments about the house. The sudden interest in my will. She listened, took notes, and then she asked me a question that changed everything. She asked, Clara, what do you actually want separate from what you think you're supposed to want? Nobody had asked me that question in years. Maybe ever. What I wanted, once I let myself actually think about it, was simple. I wanted my house protected so no one could pressure me out of it, while I was still healthy and capable of living in it myself. I wanted my modest savings, the ones I'd built up over decades of frugal living, to go directly to my grandchildren's education when the time came, not filtered through their parents' hands. And I wanted more than anything for the free labor to stop. I wanted my weekends back. Over the next several months, working quietly with Susan, I placed my house into a protective trust that could not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without my explicit, notarized consent, reviewed by an independent party. I opened a separate education fund for Sophie and Tyler, funded directly, locked until they turned 18, completely outside their parents' reach. I updated my will so that my remaining assets, should anything happen to me, would go into that same fund rather than to Brian and Melissa directly. And I began, slowly, quietly, declining weekend requests. I have plans, I would say, and leave it at that. I did not explain. I did not apologize. For the first time in years, I did not owe anyone an explanation for my own time. You can imagine how well that went over. Melissa called me twice that first month I said no to a weekend, her voice sharp and confused, asking why I was suddenly so unavailable. I simply said I was busy, and I was because I had started meeting Iris for lunch every other Saturday, and I had joined a watercolor class at the community center that I had wanted to try for 15 years and never had the time for. My life, quietly, was becoming mine again. Brian eventually confronted me directly, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, asking why I was pulling away from the family. I looked my son in the eye and I asked him a single question in return. I asked him what his plan had been for me and this house, once I got too old to manage on my own, in his own words. I watched something flicker across his face, that particular look of a person caught halfway between a lie and the truth, and he didn't have an answer ready. That silence answered the question for both of us. Everything came to a head at Thanksgiving. I had invited them to my house as I always did, and this time I invited Susan too, introducing her simply as a friend, which was not entirely a lie. After the meal, once the children were settled in the living room with a movie, I asked Brian and Melissa to sit with me and Susan at the table. I told them calmly that I loved them, and that I loved my grandchildren more than my own life. And then I told them what I had done. The trust. The education fund. The updated will. I told them in plain words that the house was not going to be sold out from under me. Not now, not later, not without my full and willing consent. And that if anything ever happened to me, my savings would go straight to Sophie and Tyler's futures, not through anyone else's hands first. Melissa's face went through about 4 different emotions in the space of 10 seconds. Brian just stared at the table, the same way he'd stared at the kitchen floor all those years earlier, Except this time there was nowhere left to hide behind, no one else's silence to disappear into. Susan, calm as ever, simply confirmed that everything was fully executed and legally binding, that there was no version of events where this could be quietly undone or renegotiated over a holiday dinner. I remember Melissa saying, almost in disbelief, "You planned all of this without telling us?" And I remember answering her in the steadiest voice I have ever used in my life, that I had spent 4 years telling them exactly what I needed, and they had never once listened, so this time I simply stopped asking permission. I still see my grandchildren. That part matters to me more than anything else in this story, and I want you to know it. But now I see them on my terms, when I have the energy, when it's a joy rather than an obligation, sometimes for an afternoon, sometimes overnight, never again as an unpaid, unappreciated default arrangement disguised as love. Brian and Melissa have not tried to sell my house. They can't. And somewhere in the last several months, something in Brian softened, whether from guilt or genuine reflection I honestly cannot say. But he calls me now just to talk, not just to drop off children. Melissa and I are still finding our footing, and I don't know yet what that relationship becomes. But I know this. I am no longer a woman waiting quietly for her family to decide her worth. I decided it myself and I put it in writing, and nobody can take that away from me now. If you made it this far, I want you to remember something before you go. You are allowed to protect yourself even from people you love. Especially from people you love. Being generous does not mean being erased. If this story meant something to you, give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to draw a line with your own family. I read every word, and I will be back soon with another story. Take care of yourselves out there.